So what we're looking at here is a 58-page household manual from Jeffrey Epstein's private island. But, it's so much more than just a set of rules. It's really a blueprint for an entire architecture of control that was designed to build a world based on absolute, unbreakable secrecy. Let's dive into how it actually worked.
It really all boils down to one central kind of haunting question. How in the world do you enforce total silence across an entire island? An island with staff, guests, visitors? The answer, it turns out, lies in this meticulously crafted, two-tiered system of control.
Okay, so the first layer of this system was all about psychological control, and it was aimed directly at the island staff. The whole goal was to basically transform them into what the manual itself called functional ghosts, to make them, for all intents and purposes, completely invisible. And yeah, that's the actual term from the manual, a functional ghost. And you have to understand, this wasn't just some quirky job title. It was a mandated identity. Staff were literally required to do their jobs without leaving any kind of social or emotional trace. It's like their own humanity had to be completely suppressed, all for the sake of guest privacy.
So how did they enforce this? Well, through these incredibly specific, almost bizarre rules. First, you had the silent servant protocol. Basically, no small talk. You don't start a conversation, period. You become just another object in the room. Second, something they called linguistic sanitization. You couldn't even use a simple word like yeah, because that might hint at casual familiarity. It created this rigid, formal barrier. And third, physical neutralization. Think about this. You couldn't even stand with your hands in your pockets. Why? Because that might look too relaxed, too human.
When you strip it all away, it just comes down to this one simple, chilling mantra. See nothing, hear nothing, say nothing. And this wasn't a suggestion, right? This was the absolute foundation of their job, of their very existence on that island. You were being paid to be blind, deaf, and mute.
But here's the thing. This intense psychological conditioning of the staff, that was only one half of the architecture. It was all designed to create this silent, invisible backdrop for a much, much more severe form of control. One that wasn't just psychological, it was absolute.
So now we get to the second layer of the system. This part was designed specifically for young visitors. And for them, control wasn't about rules of etiquette. No, it was about total physical and environmental coercion. It started with the very ground they were standing on. You see, the most powerful tool in this entire system wasn't a rule book. It was the island itself, its remoteness, its isolation. That wasn't just a park for privacy. It was the primary mechanism of entrapment. Control didn't start with a command. It started with geography. Just think about what this means for a second. If you're on that island, you have literally no way off unless Epstein allows it. You can't call a cab, you can't walk down to a public ferry. Every single mode of transportation, the boats, the helicopters, it was all his. This creates a state of complete and total dependency, turning what looks like a beautiful paradise into an inescapable cage. And this dependency could be weaponized in some truly cruel ways. There's one documented account, for example, where after an argument about her weight, a young woman's normal meals were just taken away. Instead, she was given only cucumbers and tomatoes. This wasn't just a petty punishment, it was a raw demonstration of absolute power over someone's most basic human needs.
So when you start to put these two systems together, the psychological and the physical, you really begin to see the full picture. It's not just a collection of random, weird rules. It's a carefully designed architecture where every single part reinforces the other, all to create this sealed-off, silent world.
Let's just break it down one more time. On one side, you have the staff. The method? Psychological rules. The goal? Enforce secrecy. They were the silent, invisible witnesses. Then, on the other side, you have the young visitors. The method? Total physical isolation. The goal? To ensure complete coercion. The silence of the staff made the isolation of the visitors that much more terrifying and profound. See how it works? One group was controlled specifically to ignore what was happening to the other. And all of this, it really leaves us with one final, critical question. The entire system was built.
All right, let's just jump right in. We usually think of buildings as, shelter, maybe as art. But what if a building could be something else? What if it could be a weapon, a machine, meticulously designed for social engineering? That's what we're digging into today, this idea of the architecture of calculated influence. It's a wild question when you think about it, isn't it? How can just brick and mortar, glass and steel be used to actively manipulate how people see you, to forge connections, and even exert control over some of the most powerful people on the planet? So to figure that out, our source material points to a really chilling case study. And let's be crystal clear here, the crimes Jeffrey Epstein committed were absolutely monstrous. Our goal isn't to talk about the man himself, but to dissect one of his key tools of manipulation by unpacking the secrets of his Manhattan mansion. Because this thing, it wasn't just a home. It was a carefully crafted stage with a very, very specific purpose. And that gets us to our first big idea, a blueprint for influence. You have to stop seeing this place as a house and start seeing it for what it was, a physical space engineered from the ground up to get specific social results. The whole design was guided by this one concept that our source calls calculated influence. And what does that mean? Well, it's the strategy of using a physical space to actively shape what people think, who they meet, and at the end of the day, to control them. It's basically turning architecture into a strategic weapon. So let's peel back the first layer of how this all worked. It started with the performance of power. Before anything else, the mansion had to scream one thing: immense, unbelievable wealth and status. And boy, did it work. According to the source, the second you walk through that door, the whole environment reinforced the perception that Epstein had become a major player in elite society. And you gotta understand, that wasn't an accident. That was the intended, calculated first impression. So how do you do it? Well, it was all about these super powerful visual cues. First, you have the ridiculous size of the property, right in one of the most expensive cities in the world. Then you layer on top of that elaborate art collections and these high-end custom furnishings. Every single thing you saw was a statement piece designed to psychologically overwhelm you the moment you stepped inside. But just showing off money, that wasn't the whole story. And this is where the strategy gets a lot more clever. It was also designed to be an intellectual stage. It was all about creating this atmosphere that suggested not just wealth, but like deep scientific and intellectual gravitas. The mansion was basically a movie set, and it was filled with what you could call props for a thinker. The source says it was packed with scientific artifacts, and the decor was chosen specifically to get people talking about smart stuff. This let Epstein steer conversations to really complex topics like theoretical physics, making himself seem like an intellectual peer. It was a classic halo effect, using the legitimacy of science to make himself seem credible. And this table really just lays it all out, doesn't it? The appearance was patron of science, but the function was to bolster a specific image. He looked like a serious thinker, but the real goal was to steer and control conversations. It's that gap between genuine interest and cold strategic performance that's so crucial. Okay, so we've got the performance of power and the performance of intellect. Now let's talk about how this all became operational. This is the hub of secrecy. This is all about how the physical building was engineered for networking and for total control. Now, the key thing to get is that this was never a party house for big, rowdy get-togethers. No. The whole design was built for small, intimate, and super exclusive gatherings. The goal was to get really powerful people from finance, politics, and science into a place that felt private, protected, and totally secret. And the level of control was just mechanical. Let's just walk through the steps here. 1. Invite powerful people into this very private space. 2. Use exclusive meeting rooms to make it feel super secret and important. 3. You strictly limit where anyone can go. And 4. Guests are escorted everywhere by staff. Every single step is a mechanism to manage exactly what people see and experience. And that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the final equation. We've seen all the parts, the power moves, the intellectual stage, the mechanics of control. Now let's put it all together and see what the ultimate point of this whole architectural design really was. So you've got prestige to make people feel awe, legitimacy so they take you seriously, networking to build connections, and control to manage the whole show. Each of these things we've talked about wasn't the end goal. They were all just gears in a much larger machine, all working for one single overarching purpose. And this is it. The source calls it controlled visibility. And the paradox here is what makes it so brilliant and so sinister. It's the strategy of being seen just enough to build your influence, to be a name people know in elite circles, while at the same time using the very walls around you to hide what you're really doing. The mansion was both a stage for the world and a fortress to hide everything happening behind closed doors. And that kind of leaves us with a pretty heavy question to think about, right? If one single home can be designed so precisely for influence and control, what other spaces in our lives are doing the same thing? The offices we work in, the stores we shop at, even the public parks where we hang out. How are they designed to shape what we think, how we feel, and what we do? It's a whole new, kind of scary lens to see the world through. Most of the time, when we talk about Jeffrey Epstein, we focus on the heinous crimes themselves. And of course, that's the core of the story. But today, we're going to shift our focus a bit. We're going to look at the how, the actual evidentiary roadmap that investigators had to follow to expose a criminal network that was hiding in plain sight. So, this is the central question, right? This is the puzzle investigators were facing. How on earth do you begin to untangle a web that's woven with so much power, influence, and secrecy, spanning the entire globe? It honestly seems impossible. But the answer, it turns out, doesn't start with some dramatic raid. It starts with something, well, a lot more ordinary. Okay, so first things first. Before anything else, investigators had to just map the network itself. And think about the scale we're talking about here. Connections that stretched across finance, politics, science, you name it, across multiple continents. This was never about just one person. It was about an entire ecosystem. And to even begin to understand it, they had to start with the raw data. And that leads us straight to the paper trail. Look, in any complex investigation like this, you have to start with what you can prove, objectively. Before you can get to the why, you have to lock down the who, the what, and the when. And for them, that foundation was built from a literal mountain of documents. And just look at the tools they started with. It's almost surprisingly low-tech. We're talking flight manifests, private phone books, personal calendars. This wasn't some high-tech digital forensics, not at first. It was good old-fashioned biographical data that, when you started layering it all together, began to form a kind of blueprint of the network. And here's a peek at how that worked in practice. They didn't just, read a flight log in a vacuum. No way. They would see a flight on a certain date, then they'd immediately pull up the contact lists to see who Epstein knew at that destination. It's this constant cross-referencing that starts to turn these isolated little data points into a connected, verifiable map of the network. But, and this is a really critical point, a paper trail can only take you so far. It proves association. It shows you who was where and when. What it can't prove is intent. It doesn't tell you what happened behind closed doors. And for that, the investigation had to pivot from documents to people. It had to move from the data trail to the human story. And that brings us to the incredible power of testimony. This is the moment where all that black and white data gets filled in with color, with context, and with meaning. This is where the investigation really shifts from just tracing connections to truly understanding the crimes. Now, one of the main tools for this is the deposition, and it's really important to understand what this is. It's not just an interview. It's a formal, sworn statement made under oath. And that oath, that gives a witness's story immense legal power. It turns their words into actionable evidence. This right here, this is the moment the whole investigation was transformed. As the source material makes perfectly clear, it was the accounts from survivors that finally revealed the systematic patterns of abuse. All those dots on the map from the flight logs, testimony is what finally connected them and exposed the horrifying picture they really made. So now you have two powerful streams of evidence, the hard data and the human testimony. The next step is to actually build the legal case. This whole phase is about taking that huge mountain of information and forging it into a weapon that can be used in a court of law. And there's a really clear three-step path to prosecution here. First, the investigators synthesize everything. They weave the data and the testimony together into one coherent narrative. Second, the lawyers take that narrative and use it to draft judicial filings. And finally, those filings create the legal foundation for formal government indictments. And that's really the heart of this stage. It's all about turning chaos into order. It's this methodical process of taking scattered bits of evidence, a flight log here, a piece of testimony there, and converting it all into a structured legal argument that is ready to stand up to intense scrutiny in court.
So after all that work, after following the paper, gathering the testimony, and meticulously building the legal case, what does the finished puzzle even look like? What did this whole evidentiary process end up exposing?
Well, the evidence revealed something so much bigger than the crimes of just one man. It exposed a sophisticated, global network of influence. And most critically, it laid bare the entire operational structure of what authorities would eventually, and formally, label a criminal enterprise. And so, at the end of the day, we're left with this question. This evidentiary roadmap, this painstaking process of combining data, testimony, and legal strategy, it's clearly a powerful tool. But what does seeing it applied in this case really teach us about the immense challenges and the very real possibilities of holding power to account?
All right, today we are diving deep into one very specific official document from the Epstein case, the property search inventory. Now, you might look at it and think, it's just a list, right? But what we're going to see is that this list tells an incredible story about how a massive investigation actually gets built piece by piece.
So that really gets us to the main question here. What does a document like this, an official evidence inventory, actually tell us? Well, it's a lot more than just a list of stuff. It's really a window, a direct look into the methodical, behind-the-scenes work of building a federal case.
To really understand this list, you got to start at the very beginning. And it all comes down to the legal groundwork that lets investigators even walk through the door, the search warrants.
So a property search inventory, it's not just some quickly jotted down note. No, this is a serious legal document. Its whole purpose is to create an official, super detailed record of every single thing that's seized. It's all about accountability and creating a clear, unbroken chain of custody for the evidence. And that's exactly where this all kicked off. As the source document shows us, search warrants were officially executed at multiple properties owned by Epstein. This is like the legal starting gun. It's the moment a court gives its permission, its authorization, for law enforcement to go into a private space and start collecting what could be potential evidence. Okay, so the warrants are served. The investigators are inside. What happens next? Well, that brings us right to the heart of this ledger, the incredibly meticulous job of cataloging every piece of evidence. And the outcome of all those searches was the creation of these super detailed inventories. You can almost think of it like a forensic audit. Every item that was taken, whether it's a massive computer or just a single piece of paper, was formally logged and accounted for. So what was actually on this list? Well, the official inventory breaks it down into 4 big categories: computers, cameras, documents, and disks and files. Right away, just with that simple breakdown, you get a really clear idea of the kinds of information the investigators were after. Okay, let's break this down. The first category lumps together all the digital stuff: the computers, the disks, the files. You know, in pretty much any modern investigation, this is ground zero. This is where the hunt for digital footprints begins. On hard drives, servers, you name it. Any device that could be holding just massive amounts of data.
Next up, the inventory makes a point to specifically list cameras. The very fact that these devices were pulled out and given their own category, well, that tells you something. It points to a real focus on collecting any equipment that could have been used for photographic or video recording.
And last, we have documents. It's so easy to forget about old-school paper in our digital world, but this category is absolutely critical. We're talking about every piece of paper they seized. Could be financial records, personal notes, letters, anything at all that could provide a physical paper trail. But, just listing out the categories doesn't really capture the full picture. The document itself points us to something much, much bigger: the sheer scale of everything that was collected. And there it is. That's the key phrase, pulled word for word from the official record. The scale of evidence recovered. See, the document isn't just telling us what they found, it's making a point to emphasize how much they found. The quantity itself becomes a huge part of the story. This really shows the difference, doesn't it? Finding one item, that's like finding a single piece of a jigsaw puzzle. But a scaled inventory like this, that's like being handed the entire puzzle box. It's the difference between having one single data point and having a literal mountain of potential data to sift through. So after looking at all this, what's the big takeaway from this evidence ledger? Well, it's that this seemingly simple document gives us something incredibly valuable. It's basically the blueprint of the entire investigation. When you boil it all down, this ledger tells a really clear 3-step story. First, warrants gave the legal green light to start the search. Second,
Inventories created a formal, accountable record of everything that was taken. And third, the final list reveals the absolutely massive scale of the material that investigators were now facing.
And honestly, that is the most important thing to understand here. The inventory doesn't tell us what was on those computers or what was written in those documents. But what it does do, and what it's meant to do, is define the scope. It draws the perimeter and shows us just how vast the investigative job ahead really was.
Which of course leaves us with one last. So, today we're diving into something pretty unique. The official testimonies from the staff who actually worked on Jeffrey Epstein's private island. You know, these first-hand accounts, they give us probably the clearest picture we've ever had of how that place really operated. Let's get right into it. This is the big question, right? For years, the island has been just completely shrouded in speculation. There are hardly any direct witnesses. Finding any concrete information has been almost impossible, which is exactly why these staff testimonies we're looking at are so incredibly important. Think about it. The staff, the people who cooked, cleaned, and just kept the property running, they were the only ones who saw the day-to-day reality of that place. They were kind of just figures in the background, but their statements are absolutely crucial. And when you look at them, their testimonies consistently point to three key areas of the whole operation.
Okay, so the first major theme that just jumps out from what the staff said is this constant, and I mean constant stream of visitors. It wasn't just about who was showing up, but also how they arrived and what the staff saw happening over and over and over again.
And the staff testimonies were really specific on two things. First, they all described the arrivals as frequent. This wasn't just an occasional visit here and there, it was a steady flow. And second, and this is so crucial, they consistently used the word young to describe many of these visitors. These details, coming straight from eyewitnesses, are a really critical piece of the puzzle.
So that leads to a pretty obvious question. If you have that much activity, all these people coming and going, how on earth do you keep it a secret? Well, according to the staff, the answer was an intense and really all-encompassing code of silence.
And listen, this was not some casual request for discretion. We're not talking about a hey, what happens here stays here kind of vibe. The testimonies describe this ironclad privacy rule that was a completely non-negotiable condition. It didn't matter if you were staff or a guest, this rule was absolute law, and it was designed for one thing and one thing only: total secrecy.
So how did this rule actually work? Well, the staff testimonies basically break it down into three core principles. First, discretion wasn't just a good idea, it was an absolute requirement for being there. Second, this rule applied to everybody: staff, visitors, pilots, you name it, zero exceptions. And third, the enforcement of this rule was described as constant and just unwavering. This whole system created an environment where silence wasn't just expected, it was systemically enforced.
And this brings us to the third major theme from these testimonies: the physical and logistical isolation. I mean, how do you enforce such strict rules? Simple. You control the entire environment. According to the staff, the complex travel logistics were the real key to making this happen.
Getting there was this whole, tightly controlled, multi-step process. The staff described how it wasn't a simple flight. Visitors would first land at specific designated airports, often far from the final destination. From there, they'd be moved onto private aircraft, and then finally, they would take one last private trip by either boat or helicopter to even get to the island. You see how each step was another deliberate layer of separation from the outside world.
And the whole purpose behind these complicated logistics, well, it was pretty clear. It was all about control. By managing every single stage of that journey, the operation could filter and monitor every person who set foot on that island. This place wasn't just private, it was a completely sealed environment.
So when you put all three of these key elements from the staff testimonies together, you've got the frequent arrivals of young visitors, this strict and unwavering code of silence, and then the complex logistics that created total isolation. They all point in one direction. They describe a meticulously designed operation that was highly controlled, deeply secretive, and just totally cut off from the rest of the world.
And that really leaves us with this final critical question. The staff testimonies, they give us a glimpse into the mechanics of how this world worked, but they also force us to think about a much broader issue. In any situation where the powerful can...
Okay, so let's talk about the files that really kicked this whole thing off, the Palm Beach evidence. In this explainer, we're going to get past all the headlines and show you exactly what was in them and, more importantly, why they became the foundation for one of the most high-profile cases of our time. Let's dive in. Right, so for years, we've all heard this term thrown around, the Palm Beach Files. But what does that actually mean? What kind of evidence did investigators really find? And how did it end up shaping everything that came next? That's what we're here to break down. To understand any of this, we have to start in one very specific place, Palm Beach, Florida. And look, this wasn't just a random location on a map. It was the absolute epicenter. The evidence that was gathered right here would set the stage for a legal saga that would go on for more than a decade. You know, this timeline tells a huge part of the story all by itself. So you've got the alleged activity back in the early 2000s. Then, boom, 2005, the police inquiry starts. That all leads to this really controversial plea deal in 2008. But here's the kicker. Fast forward to 2019, a whole decade later, and that exact same period becomes the core of a brand new federal indictment. That just goes to show you how absolutely crucial that first Palm Beach investigation really was. And it's kind of wild because it all centered on just one building. This wasn't some huge sprawling operation across multiple cities, not at first anyway. Nope, investigators completely zeroed in on this one house, and it became the physical, and you could say symbolic, hub for the whole case back then.
Okay, so let's pop the hood. What was actually inside these files that made them so famous? What did investigators really collect?
Well, it was like a puzzle with a bunch of different pieces. You've got the human stories, right? Testimony from witnesses and staff. And a really disturbing pattern started to emerge there. This whole massage pretext. Then you have the hard data, the logistics, the recruitment methods, the travel records. And all of that stuff together created the paper trail that led straight to that big legal agreement. And this is where it gets really interesting because you can see how investigators pieced it all together. It's like they had two parallel tracks of evidence that just reinforced each other. Over here, you've got cold, hard facts, flight logs showing all this constant travel. And over there, you've got the human testimony, people describing the house as this central hub. So the logs weren't just about travel, they were the proof, the corroboration that what the witnesses were saying was actually happening. And you really can't overstate how important this one detail was for investigators. This massage thing, it wasn't a random excuse someone used once. No, witnesses described it as a system, a consistent, recurring pattern. And when you can establish a pattern like that, well, that's how you build a powerful case. So you've got all this evidence piling up. The logical next step would be a trial, right? Well, no. Instead, it led to something else entirely. One of the most fiercely debated plea deals you'll ever hear about. Yeah, 2008, that was the year. All that evidence gathered by the Palm Beach police, it directly led to that hugely controversial non-prosecution agreement, that plea deal with federal prosecutors. And honestly, this is why those original files cast such a long shadow. That 2008 agreement didn't end the story, not even close. It basically just shifted the legal battle to a new arena. Years later, up in New York, you had lawyers still arguing about that same agreement. And the entire basis for their arguments, it all went back to the evidence in those first Palm Beach files. But the files did more than just document what had already happened. They were also kind of like a roadmap, pointing investigators toward a much, much bigger picture. I mean, this is literally how a local Florida case blew up into a global story. Think about it. Investigators started here with the Palm Beach evidence. They used it like a key. They took names, they took dates, and then they started checking them against other evidence, like flight manifests and that infamous black book of contacts. And just like that, piece by piece, they started to map out this huge, interconnected, international network. Okay, so let's bring it all home. We've seen the timeline, we've looked inside the files, we've seen the fallout. So why? Why are these specific files so incredibly important? Well, here's the bottom line. The Palm Beach files aren't just a stack of papers. They're the official record of the very first time the legal system seriously grappled with these allegations. They set the precedents, they created the legal challenges, and they became the bedrock of evidence for everything, and I mean everything, that came after. And that really leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? In any huge, complex case, you have to wonder, how much does that very first chapter truly dictate the rest of the story? You know, the initial evidence, those early decisions. If the story of the Palm Beach files teaches us anything, it's that the answer is a whole lot.
Hey, if you're fascinated by real investigations, hidden evidence, and the stories behind the headlines, make sure you subscribe to Crime Evidence Files. Every week we uncover new case files, interrogation tapes, and courtroom revelations that most people never see. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss the next case. Click the next video to uncover more investigation files together.